Many of us have had the feeling that something wonderful was about to happen, that life was full of promise, and that we would play an important part in making the world a better place. This passion and idealism blossoms during adolescence as we look at the world with completely new eyes. Hello, I'm Kitty Hilton, and in this program we're going to stretch our limits by discovering new ways to look at our young adults. As with our other programs, Chilton Pearce will challenge us to look at ourselves in completely new ways. Joe began his exploration of human development with the publication of his first book, Cracking the Cosmic Egg. This was followed by his national bestseller, The Magical Child, and most recently, Evolution's End. Let's join with Joe and a group of parents, educators, and healthcare providers as they look at adolescence and what lies beyond.
Let's look at the adolescents as a real, genuine group, let's say, of the mid-teens or even the teens themselves. As I said, adolescence is by and large an arbitrary category created within our day and time for a group of people that have no place. We have no room for them in the economic scheme of things, and so we've created this category for them. But nevertheless, there are some very genuine things about adolescence that I would like to take up today. Betty Staley of the Steiner School, the Waldorf School, and the college in Fair Oaks, California. Now, we've done many workshops together, and she turned out a remarkable book called Between Form and Freedom, which was a study of the adolescent, an English publication. I've forgotten exactly the name of the publisher, but it's Between Form and Freedom, a little paperback, has some marvelous insights. There are three facets of the adolescent I would like to bring up that are not ordinarily mentioned about the adolescent. And you will find these, I'm sure, quite resonant with you. The first of these characteristics of adolescence that we've already taken up starts around age 11, but by 15 or so, it hits a kind of a critical, acute level. And that is an idealism. The average person looks at the adolescent and they say, idealism, this is the craziest thing we ever heard. They don't have an idealistic bone in their body. Look at their models and so on and so forth. Now, the issue is, and it was Betty that made this so clear to me, they are so acutely, painfully idealistic. Starting about age 11, growing to about 14 or 15, and they start looking at the world through totally different eyes. This was when all of a sudden our children start dropping behind us on the street. They don't want to walk right with us. Do you ever have that happen? Here, I know with all my young'uns, for years they looked up to me as though I were God, and I liked that very much. And suddenly they hit this certain age, and they're looking at the old man, and they're noticing he has dandruff, and kind of bald, and kind of small. Not so much after all. In schools, our little children march in dutifully, good morning teacher, and they're loving and obedient and so on, and all of a sudden they hit this age, and they're looking at the teacher and they say, what do you know? And they're challenging the teacher every minute. And the teacher's offended by this. They're threatened by it, so on. What's going on? Well, it's just suddenly nothing of their own doings. They're looking at the world through a prism, a new perspective. And they're looking for a model that will match their idealism. That's all they're doing. And they're looking at us through this idealistic frame of reference which suddenly comes up, and they find us falling short. They weigh us and we are wanting, as the statement goes. And so we're offended by this. But understand that at this point, they need a model that matches that idealism. I ask you to quickly examine the models we give our young people. Just look at it. Who are their models? The pop stars, the rock stars, the movie stars, the sports stars, at best maybe the political stars, Donald Trump. Really, these are their models. And on every hand, and I say this in all kindness, on every hand, no one means to do this, the models betray what the young person is looking for. They simply betray them. They don't match up at all. That's not what they're after. It doesn't fit the need. It's not appropriate. And they keep looking. And at a certain point, and it's happening earlier and earlier, at a certain point, what happens? In place of the idealism comes despair, a loss of hope of finding the model, and cynicism, anger, frustration, and the adoption of models who represent the exact opposite to what they're really after. And that comes about from their feeling of futility and helplessness at ever finding what they really want. And so they kind of choose anti-heroes. Instead of those who measure up to virtue, uprightness, all this that they felt at age 11, justice, fairness, and so on, they pick the punk star who says, "Don't kill me, I'm already dead." That's what they wear on their T-shirts. "Don't kill me, I'm already dead." And that becomes the kind of cynical, and they all practice at this. They play it. They have to be tough, sophisticated, and cynical one another. That is, to deny their idealism. Why must they deny it so vigorously? What is it Macbeth said? "The lady doth protest too much." They deny it so vigorously because it's too painful. Their loss of idealism is too painful to them. So they pick their anti-models. And of course, the society is anxious to provide those for them because through those models, you can make billions of dollars out of that frustration and rage of your young people. Now let's take the second thing about the adolescent. This will start up somewhere probably around 14 or 15. I can tell you by 16 it's so painful. It just is literally very heavy in a person's life. And that's the feeling, what I call the great expectation. Great expectation. And that is the feeling that something tremendous is supposed to happen. And it's supposed to happen right now. And instant by instant, we wait for it as young people. I was talking about this with a radio announcer once. And he was one of these tough guys who battens around his guests, and plays the tough role. And I mentioned this business. "Can't you remember when you were an adolescent, this feeling that something tremendous was supposed to happen in your life?" He said, "What do you mean, remember it in my life?" He said, "I've been waiting for it all my life, and it hasn't happened yet. And blankety blank, I don't think it ever will." And he said that I used to wait. He said, "I thought every corner I turned, it was going to happen. Every time I went up over a little hill, it was going to happen. And it never did." I loved that. You see, but that really speaks for us all. This feeling of great expectation, this constant anticipation that something is supposed to happen, and we expect it right now. My favorite example, I have several, but it was a letter from a young man in a university back east to his parents in New Mexico. He said he loved his third year of college. He was a junior, and he was a star in every way. He was an athlete, and he was popular, and he made top grades. And how everything was going his way, it was wonderful. He loved his school more than ever. But something happened that he had to try to share, and there was no one to share it with except his parents. He said, "I awakened the other night with," quote, and he put it in quotes because it was so dramatic, "the cold hand of terror clutching my heart." And he said, what it was, I suddenly remembered that since I was 14, I've been waiting constantly for something tremendous that was supposed to happen. And I woke up in the middle of the night realizing that I was almost 21, and it had never happened yet. And the thought occurred to me, suppose it never happens, and I never even know what it was supposed to have been. The issue wasn't that he couldn't bear up under the disappointment of it never happening. The issue was he could not bear not knowing what it was supposed to have been. See? And this is the adolescent. I think of George Leonard writing in Esquire magazine in his 16th year there in Atlanta, Georgia. He and his young friends getting together for their great bull sessions that would last all night long. Maybe you can remember that. And how they would exhaust all topics of women and sports cars or racing and so on and so forth, and finally get around to the terrifying subject of what this was. There's always this gesture, you see, toward the heart, what it is. And he spoke of this anguished longing, so intense, we knew it could never be assuaged. You see. And the problem is, it can't even be articulated. Can't be put into words. All the young person can do is kind of futilely gesture toward it. And that's all. This great anticipation of something tremendous that's supposed to happen. And the third issue is the feeling of hidden greatness as a person. Hidden greatness. I remember at 16, I was working a full-time job under an emergency wartime civil service job, and quite an anonymous little person. And I used to think, I was completely filled with myself. I was just exploding with this hugeness inside. And I used to think, now, here I am walking down the street, a completely unknown. If they, you know how teenagers are always referring to they, if they just knew who I really was, they'd all stand back and make way for me. But I didn't know what this was myself, and I would wonder, how am I ever going to let them know how incredibly great I really am? See? And doesn't that register with us all of that teenage period? This feeling of secret, hidden uniqueness. Nothing like me could have ever happened before. When I first read Thomas Wolfe, the original Thomas Wolfe back in the 30s, Look Homeward, Angel, You Can't Go Home Again, Of Time and the River. These were great, huge monuments written back then, and remarkable works, because he expressed this whole thing as perfectly as it's ever been expressed in this world. So did Salinger in Catcher in the Rye. You'll pick up a lot of this from that, you see. And so this is the plight of the teenager. Now, what is going on? Very simply, let's look back, here we go again, to those growth spurts and developmental periods, birth, age 1, 4, 7, 11, and then we speak of 15, as everybody's saying, well, it's all over with. Piaget didn't see any signs of any further developmental stages. Rudolf Steiner did. He said by the full mature ego doesn't even appear until age 21. He spoke of much further developmental stages, but none of the biologically oriented developmentalists do. Carl Jung spoke of stages going beyond that, but no one else did. Now, we do know that the brain seems to myelinate completely, and there's no further brain growth spurts that we can detect, and so on. Marion Diamond says, well, if you challenge the brain enough, it'll continue to develop throughout life. But all of this is on a different level than we talked about before. Well, what's really supposed to happen, here we go again, this has to, I suppose, be hypothetical, even though I know it's not hypothetical, is that what's really supposed to happen. Here we go again with those 3 levels of the brain. We're still, all of these first 15 years have been devoted to what? Coming into dominion over this whole physical process. And all of the learnings that have taken place have related to this, rightly so. And then at 15, by 15, sexuality has appeared. And what is sexuality all about? Well, it's still grounding us in the physical, isn't it? It's a very happy grounding. Grounding us in the physical, refocusing our attention on it. We become completely hormonal at that point and vitally aware of our body, and so on. And it also locks us into our society, because only through the regular social channels can that sexuality achieve its ends. Now, all of that, though, nevertheless, is essentially physically oriented to complete the species propagation, and so on and so forth. At the same time, intuitively, the young person knows they are radically incomplete. Here we get to the issue that all current research is heavily indicating. It's a big debatable issue, and you can't find any consensus about it, but very strong suspicion that the great frontal lobes, the frontal lobes that are evolution's latest thing, are absolutely not developed at 15. We call them the silent areas of the brain. The recent research, which I think is most exciting, is that I've mentioned 3 times now. Here's my 4th time, I know, that these frontal lobes are still laying down their tracks throughout childhood, still completing their development throughout adolescence, and not fully mature and ready to function totally. That is the focus of development on them until early maturity. So therein lies the key of what the adolescent is all about. They realize this incompleteness. Now we say, why do they always gesture toward their heart? And they do. Because all of these are felt as great yearnings of the heart. And this isn't just metaphoric. It's felt physically as a pressure in the heart that comes up like a lump in the throat. Thomas Wolfe spoke of it as the grape bursting in the throat of this anguished longing. What it is the intelligence of the heart. Now remember, you have to go back to what we were talking about. The heart is an endocrine gland, and all those other recent discoveries of the role the heart plays, particularly with the limbic structure, and organizing the functions of the limbic system, the emotional, relational brain. And then we have to go one step further. And we find that according to Paul MacLean, the cingulate gyrus area of the limbic system, the highest, up here in the highest part of this great secondary or mammalian brain system, we have what he calls species survival itself, and branching directly into, and has apparently very close connections with the frontal lobes. Now, briefly, and this is hypothetical, the reason the anguish is felt here is because you have whatever this mysterious unified field is within us, that we call this kind of universal process, is literally longing for its expression and its full opening into its expression through its instrument called the brain. All the rest of this brain structure has been devoted to what? To simply giving us our experience of a physical life and a physical body and our interaction and relationship with it, our ability to procreate and do all these other things and keep the show going. And now we're ready to open up what? An area that is absolutely unprogrammed. Paul MacLean said, well, these frontal lobes seem to have to do with compassion, a kind of universality, sympathy, love, nurturing, care, which awakens in her a compulsion, a passion that seizes her whole life to nurture that infant at all cost. Why? Because it's connected with those frontal lobes. And so now we have the possibility that through that mother-infant interaction, literally, the child, in teaching the mother instant by instant, might lead her into her own greatest realms of being. George Leonard, in his recent book about sexuality, gives strong indication that at the highest levels of sexuality, it would literally access the frontal lobes themselves, you see. And read that. This is a very profound work. Now, in all of our spiritual traditions, nearly all of them, we have the idea of denial. Evolution's problem is this: to wean us away from our identity with lower evolutionary structures, and instead use those as the foundation to move on into higher evolutionary structures. It's just that simple. That's what it's been for a long time. We've intuitively known that for a long time. What then have we tried to do in the past? At root of nearly every great spiritual system, and this isn't to denigrate them, they're all mind-boggling and vastly beyond me, but at root of them as they form into strict religious structures, the concept of denial comes in. How are we going to wean ourselves away from these lower structures? Well, we try to deny them. We try to cut ourselves off from them. In periods of great religious frenzy back in Greece, the young men used to rush out and emasculate themselves, you see, on behalf of the goddess. Why? To try to cut themselves off, in effect, from all aspects of the lower structures. And of course, this is tremendously self-destructive. Frenzy back in Greece, the young men used to rush out and emasculate themselves, you see, on behalf of the goddess. Why? To try to cut themselves off, in effect, from all aspects of the lower structures. And of course, this is tremendously self-destructive. This isn't what evolution is about at all. Eckhart caught on when he said when the higher incorporates the lower into its structure, it changes the lower into the nature of the higher. And it was George Leonard who caught on to that about sexuality. This is something I had claimed in my fifth book, Magical Child Matures, that actually in this intense peak of emotion, of adolescent love, that could in itself be a way by which we could enter into this whole realm of the spirit. But something happens, you see, something happens. And instead, it ends up generally for us a disaster. Now, this is part of what the adolescent period is all about. This is longing for completion. Now, I made a serious error in my book, Magical Child Matures, and I perpetuated that error in Evolution's End. I saw this longing in the adolescent to be the longing for the opening of another developmental period. I was exactly right with that. There's no question. There are a lot of books coming out now about post-operational thinking. What should happen after 15? Some brilliant work is being done. At 15, instead of a closure, there should be a brain growth spurt. There is no way around that. And then the regular 3.5 to 4 year cycles, we should go through a series of developments precisely as we did in the first 15 years. There's no question about it. And these should be the discovery of what we could call the waveform aspect of the particle world that we have created and come into dominion over, which is simply the ability to move up into higher and higher echelons or realms of the whole creative process. This is being recognized little by little, and it makes perfectly good, clear sense. The only problem is to assume that this is the great inner venture of the spirit on the part of that adolescent won't work. It won't fit the adolescent. Adolescents just don't fit that pattern. Why? They are completely locked into their hormonal life, into their life in this body, the great delight in the body, and the desperate need to move out into the social world and prove themselves, all of which is a critical part of nature's plan. But as they go out to explore the world and all that it offers, exactly as they should, becoming a part of society and becoming the parents and all of that at that period, at the same time, all of that should be preparing them for the final maturation, which is the movement into the realm of the unknown or the true spiritual realm that evolution is pushing us toward. So I think from probably about 15 to 30, we're simply going through a developmental period to lay the groundwork, the bridging between the localized experience here in the world and the totally non-localized experience of what we generally lump under the heading of the spirit. What we need is a new lexicon of the spirit. We need a completely new vocabulary to cover this. Why? I think we've ruined all the other old words concerning it. They're tarnished. They've been overloaded with such nonsense that they're no longer much worth to us. Carl Jung once said, when a symbol loses its power, you simply have to let it go. And most of our great symbols have lost their power, and I think it's because of the misuse of those symbols, and now we need kind of a new symbology of the spirit. In this period of, which I would call the transition period from our complete embedment in this marvelous and what should be a very joyful life of the body toward the joyful life of the body of the spirit, because it's always the body. We're always the body. There's no doubt of that. Even when we move into a hypothetical pure spirit, you would still be the body. In that transition stage, that is adolescence, you see. And during that time, we lay all the groundwork for this final stage to unfold, which should occupy our entire mature years. And certainly, you would find a different ball game than we have today in the great despair we have in our older people and so on. Now, am I making any sense? This is that anguish of adolescence. That's why if you come along to the adolescent who's totally hormonal on the one hand and in this anguish of longing on the other, and you talk to them about misplaced libido and so on and so forth, and you must discipline yourself and give up this and give up that and the other if you want to know the spirit, something is wrong. You see, something is wrong. So I look at most of our great disciplines which have depended on what? Denial, which is at base a trade-off. And how much greater, how much more it fits the evolutionary pattern to think of incorporation of the lower into the higher and transformation. See? Transcendence. Moving beyond, but as you move beyond, everything goes with it. Everything goes with it. Or it's not a whole movement. So that's what is involved in adolescence, and that's evolution's intent. They're getting ready for the opening and the focus on those frontal lobes, but the frontal lobes aren't even complete in adolescence. They're not complete until early maturity. Now, you say, frontal lobes, what could that possibly have to do with anything? I ask you to recall again what all current scientific evidence strongly points toward. That our universe organizes itself within the neurons of our brain and presents itself to us that way. We interpret it as an external event, which it is as the result of this operation. You see, this isn't to deny the reality of the outer world. It's simply to say our perception of the outer world is an interior construction by the brain system. And the brain system, with its hundreds of billions and trillions of neural connections and possibilities, can translate into our experience a perception of the whole universal scheme of things. You see, if it can do that, then these great frontal lobes, which represent a huge chunk of it, it's estimated that only about 10% of the neocortex is actually developed. It might all be involved in the integrated circuitry it is, but we don't develop a great deal of it. There's a difference between development and usage. You use it out of default because it's going to respond. But in lack of development, it responds very weakly. Does that make any sense? I've used the analogy of usage as opposed to development, because this will take care of all the arguments in the scientific people if they just look at it. In regard to muscles, now I'm as I say, my warranty is running out. Time's getting late. But I'm very active. I use every muscle in my body every day, I'm sure. But if I should show you the sad strings hanging about my limbs, which I will spare you, you would see a striking, an unbelievable difference between those sad strings and the huge dirigibles, the blimps, the great big enormous balloons on the arms and chest of our muscle men who push weights, and muscle women who push weights, you see. That is, both of us use our muscles, but one of us develops our muscle. Guess which one, you see. The difference is astonishing. Now, we all use everything in the brain, but how much of it do we develop? That's the whole issue. We use it by default. We have nothing to do with it. There is the possibility of developing it. In studying some of the recent work of Jaden Gockenbach and others in dream research there at the University of Virginia, at Stanford University, and up in Canada, it suddenly occurred to me that dreaming is one of our most undeveloped intelligences, simply awaiting development. Carl Jung laid out a magnificent plan of action towards starting to develop dreaming as an intelligent activity. And now it's really getting into full swing. And some of the things you can do with that modality are awesome. I haven't gotten into any of that today, and I won't have a chance. But you ought to look into what's going on in group dreaming, shared dreaming, lucid dreaming, and so on. Beginning to discover we can use this, develop it rather than just use it. And the same thing certainly with the frontal lobes. What then do the frontal lobes have inherent within them? You want to know? Nothing. Nothing at all. Because they have inherent within them everything. At a certain point, everything is nothing. That is, they represent simply the total and complete unknown. The unknown. Now, the interesting thing about the frontal lobes and the realm of potential which they have inherent within them is you find out what the possibilities of them are only by interaction or participation with them, only by an entry into that realm. And then the unknown articulates or forms according to the nature of your entry into it. You see, so that you're constantly getting reflected back still, a knowing, which is a reflection of your own way of moving into the unknown. And I try to get into that in the last 2 chapters of my book, Evolution's End. It's a rather tricky subject. I would refer you to Meister Eckhart, one of my certainly primary heroes of life, when he said, to enter into that, you must drop all knowns. Everything known. He said, no name, no identification, no knowing can be carried into it whatsoever. See, he called it the cloud of unknowing. Other people have written about the cloud of unknowing. What does it mean? Well, you're entering into darkness. You're entering into the unknown. But it articulates as what? Pure light or pure being as you enter into it. So it's a purely participatory process. And it's infinitely open and possible. That is really the end of evolution. Evolution is looking for a way to surpass itself, in effect. Evolution is looking for a way to move beyond its own physical process of evolution. And we are it. I think even the discovery of things like lasers and all that is simply, which never existed before. These are just little examples. Evolution breaks through with this and enlightens the mind of the discoverer, and he writes it all down feverishly, and it brings something totally new into the world, into the whole universe. You don't find it anywhere else. So that's what, all of that is part of this whole evolutionary scheme. Now, this is going to wind us up for this business of the adolescent. I would summarize it by saying what we need is, in this new lexicon of the Spirit is emphasis of the fact that there's no giving up of anything because we have nothing to give up. That's ego on our part to think we have anything we can trade off with this evolutionary process, function. You can call it whatever you like. As a result, there's no denial, because when you start denying, you're saying there are parts of the evolutionary process that should not be evolved. See, we carry it all with us. We are the totality of the evolutionary process. You find it all within us. That's what McLean kept saying. And we carry it all with us, or none of it, really. So that's the other part of it, is no denial, no trade-off, but instead the incorporation of the lower into the higher, and that's something we can't ourselves do. And so my proposal in my book is that there is this incredible intelligence, power, force, which we can say expresses itself in an evolutionary fashion, which is always there to move us on, to wean us away from the lower structures into that highest of all structure. And the reward system, what do the biologists now say the reward system of the brain is? Here in this limbic structure, here in this emotional cognitive system, and its direct connections with the heart. So what evolution must do is win us from seeking our rewards in all these intellectual plays with the physical system, and show us that there are incredible rewards, even greater than that, in this totally unknown, open potential system. And then that is where evolution would achieve its greatest end. The problem with that is, of course, establishing access to this open-ended field and learning to operate as simply a field within a field. And all of that, of course, plunges us into some heavy philosophical kind of stuff we can think about. The access to the field is done through models. I don't know how you can do it without a model. You have to have the idea somewhere planted in your mind. I think the reason for the appearance of semantic abstract language at age 11 is not just that we might understand physical or chemical terms and so on and so forth, but only through an abstract semantic language could we have presented to us the possibilities of an open-ended structure that has no content, but creates content according to the nature of our entry into it. You see, so it never repeats itself, and it's never the same instant from instant, but everything is always new. It's a very exciting proposition. As you can see right now, this thing that should happen at adolescence could happen any time in life. There is no question in my mind about it. I know that through meeting teachers and meeting models and all, in my 50s, I got blown out of orbit. I got blown out of orbit so many different times. It's not funny. And I know that things happen to me that I would never have believed possible in life. Totally impossible kind of things going on. And exciting. I mean, really exciting. And I think for life should be exciting. As the older you get, the more exciting it should become, you see. And it can. And I think this is great. This is what it's all about. So there's a gentleman who said the laborer coming to the vineyard at the 11th hour gets the same wage as the one who comes at the first hour. And so that's what that adolescent is looking forward to, and it can happen any old time. Well, what we want to talk about, I think of that marvelous question someone asked, it was such a heartfelt question. You know, all this is just great. This is exciting, and we hear a lot about this, and it's kind of the new age. Hey, but what are we going to do specifically? What can we do about the riots? What do we do about the kids killing themselves? And so on. The first thing I would think of is in applying some of this would be to distinguish, and I've talked about this before, being responsible to the world and responsible for the world. I'm responsible to the world. Every action I make, I have to make in response to the needs of my situation, the situation of the world I'm in. But I'm not responsible for the world. The minute I think I'm responsible for the world, I will start and project out there all the business, you see. And really that's kind of playing God. It gets us into some pretty tricky areas. So we're not responsible for the world, we're responsible to the world. As a parent, I was not responsible for my children, I was responsible to them. To make it clear. There's a certain amount you can do for your children as a parent, and believe me, if you're a parent, you know this to be true. There comes a certain point where no more can you do. And you just have to go along behind for a while and pick up the pieces of those kids and put them back together as best you can. You've done all you can. My teacher, George Jadar, once said, we've done all the damage to them we can do by the time they're 11 years old. Well, that might be true. But nevertheless, we are responsible to them, even when we are not responsible for them. The same thing with our world in general. You always have to be willing to let your neighbor take the chance of making the wrong decision, as opposed to you're trying to make their decisions for them, when you feel your responsibility for them rather than to them. The problem with governments is they begin to distrust their populace in the ability to make their own decisions and try to mandate decisions, lest people make the wrong decision, with the result that finally there are no right decisions possible to be made. The second step I think we can, and these are to me very practical things. This applies to me and my attitude toward my neighbor, which is all it is. My attitude toward the world is my attitude toward the neighbor. And we've got to watch this, that the first thing we'll do when we say we must change the world generally interprets as, I must change my neighbor's behavior. Think about it. In all of your passion to change the world, it means changing somebody's behavior out there. Think about it. It does. Whereas if we're only responsible to the world, there can be only one source of behavioral change available to us, and that's always ourself. And in this, to me, an important aspect is never resort to moral, ethical levels. Now that sounds strange. We have a whole group of young people who are damaged. Our government and our people in authority tend to revert continually to moral, ethic rhetoric concerning it, rather than trying to say, wait a minute, we're dealing with biological damage. Where does the damage come from? How can we address the damage itself before it happens, you see? That's the whole issue. If we say, oh, these young people are simply unethical, they kill each other, they do all this, that, and the other, they're immoral, whatever that might be, we have lost the game right there. It isn't to set judgment on them, it's to look for the trace of the damage. Where does it happen? There is a certain norm of the human being which has sustained the species from the beginning, you see. And deviations from that, we have to look and say, wait a minute, why? The great question, why? The great scientific inquiry should be addressed always to where is the damage coming from. And that's what we can do. And that's what really I've tried to do today. It wasn't just to set up this scenario of all these awful things happening, but the fact that if we look at them, we'll find at their roots some very clear errors. And it generally can be boiled down to what we can call biological. Now let's get into some really tricky areas. I got a lot of letters, both in response to Magical Child Matures, and I'm already getting them from Evolution's End, from irate readers who say, but, you keep talking about the mother, what about the father? You ignore the father. Well, I'm not purposely ignoring the father. I'm concentrating on the mother because that's the most critical issue. At the risk of really offending every woman here, I think the mother is primary. This is the primal matrix. The word matrix and mother are from the same root, as you know. Matrix means the source of the material from which life springs. That's the mother. And the mother's primary. Fathers are, by and large, secondary. At best, they are poor substitutes for the primary. They can be in emergency, but it's a poor substitute. It's compensation. Our problem today is the loss of the mother. The species is losing the mother. Now, this is no joke. This is what PPNN, AA, and MANA, and all the rest of them are about. To recapture motherhood before it leaves. What do we mean by this? I think of what Plato said, and this again would be a great insult to women. I've been almost lynched from this at times. Plato said, give me a new set of mothers and I will give you a new world. The power of the mother is that great. The power of the father is not that great. Why? Because it's not primary, it's secondary. The role the father plays is different. The role it plays in evolution is different. It's for very great things, but without the mother, the male really can't play that role. See, that's the big thing about it. Lose the mother and that whole male aspect is lost along with it. Whereas if save the male aspect of it does not necessarily work the other way. So we're dealing with the loss of nurturing and the loss of the capacity to nurture. America's children, by and large, suffer enormously from the lack of nurturing. Not from you enlightened parents who already know about this and come here to hear this, but we're talking about 70% of them out there in American society. There is a serious breakdown in the emotional nurturing of a child. And that's what all this so-called bonding is about. Myth or not, the emotional nurturing of the child is the critical issue. When I think of how, to my way of thinking, women have bought into the male folly. They've kind of bought into the male cul-de-sac in a certain sense. And nurturing is what is being lost. What I find happening, and this again these are dangerous and certainly not very politically correct statements, but what I find happening is women aping the graces of the very male intellect, which is robbing them of their power. It maybe is a defensive process, but it's as though threatened and backed into a corner and being stripped of their power, they think, well, I'll adopt the tactics of that force robbing me of my power. I'll adopt those tactics and maybe I can regain some power. But they've regained the power of the male intellect, which they have anyway, at the cost of the female nurturing intelligence. And that is serious. It's serious to our whole race, our whole species. Rejecting their own strength as they adopt the strengths of male intellect. Does that make any sense? That is, the strength of the woman lies in her being the mother of the species and accepting that role and not rejecting that role. And that means the nurturer, the source from which nurturing comes, the reason for the enormous male rage which faces America, where you have males beating up their females at an all-time high. We've never had anything quite like this in history, particularly in the black society of America. Males assaulting females and battering them beyond all levels of reason. Why? Because the male is radically unnurtured and he can't survive without it. Now let's look at a couple of other things. And I've got to do this in a hurry. Female role has changed dramatically since World War II. Let's look back. There's just a marvelous book that came out about the role of women in the whole history of early America. And we have women in the kitchen. The woman in the kitchen. But the kitchen of what? The American farm. 100 years ago, 96% of the population of America lived on farms. The farm was the whole lifeblood of the nation. 96% of the population lived there. What was the heart of the farm? The kitchen. A farmer without a wife in America was absolutely crippled. What did she do? She ran the kitchen, the heart of the whole enterprise. She ran the kitchen gardens, the putting up of all the food, the taking care of the cows and the chickens, the source of their direct food. She kept the books. Literally, she was the bookkeeper of the organization. She brought the children into the world. She nurtured them. She fed the hired hands. She educated the children, whatever education they got. And they all ended up remarkably well educated by and large, certainly all literate. All of this she did. She was the kingpin, literally the hub around which this huge enterprise called the farm rested. Read their accounts of life in those days. And don't think it was grim. It was not necessarily grim at all. I've read magnificent, glorious accounts of her role in that time and how she met it and the joys therein. Then this also was the extended family. She was the hub of an extended family, which was not just a nuclear family of mother, father, and child, but a great extended family. There were many people there to help her, to take over, to give her respite from those children, and so on and so forth. So it was a big give and take and a community in itself. And little by little, this started changing dramatically. And by World War II, by the end of World War II, 4% of the American population lived on farms, 96% lived in the cities. Now what do you have happening? You have a woman whose place is in the home, and whose place in the home is in the kitchen. That isn't the hub of anything. You see, all of a sudden the kitchen doesn't mean anything. You have all sorts of prepared foods. The kitchen is an instantaneous place. It doesn't require much, and so on. And you have this whole huge industry to fill that kitchen with what it needs, and so she doesn't really need to even be there, so to speak. And we say, oh, the mother's place in the home and in the kitchen. It wasn't. You see, the kitchen was not that in the 19th century. It was the center of everything. And so we put her to work. We put the mother to work during World War II because we had to have her in that industry. And all of a sudden she discovers something interesting. In this great shift that's taking place, all of a sudden there's no place there in the kitchen really for her to flourish, but she can flourish just as well in the marketplace. She discovers that she can run the industries. She can do anything out there that anybody else can do, and that's what she wants to do. She discovers she has loads of talents and capacities that can now be expressed in totally new ways. They can't be expressed in the kitchen any longer. It doesn't count for much anymore. You see what I'm talking about? And so now we have this dramatic shift and change of the woman, but immediately everything polarized. What I heard in the 50s and 60s, and I was teaching in the college at the time, but what I heard coming out of the high schools was the constant demand by the teachers of their young women students. What's the matter with you? Don't you want to make something of yourself? Do you want to just stay home and have babies? As though that were the lowest single act they could do. The failures, the dropouts, the quitters would stay home and have babies. What did that do to the mothering instinct of the whole species? It denigrated, put it the lowest item of the whole social scheme. What's the answer to this whole thing when we get into the issue of daycare? You see. So if she began to have children, there was only daycare, so she could go out and take care of her rightful place in society. I've heard many young pregnant women sitting there at their office, their desk, say to me, as I come in, we talk about her pregnancy, and she says, oh, yes, I'm only going to have to be gone for 2 weeks. Now, I'll be right back on the job. I'm not going to lose much time. She's apologetic for the time she's going to take off to have her baby. Oh, I'll be right back, as though she's abandoning her post. And so we have daycare. And it's a bad situation. It's a bad solution. I know I offended the lady here yesterday with daycare. In fact, I don't think she came back. And I'm sorry that I was offensive. But it's a bad solution to a terrible dilemma. The answer is what? What?
Raise your own children.
Oh, well, no, surely raise your own children. But what about this other aspect of the woman that now needs to be expressed? See? Is she's no longer the hub of that whole universe?
To be the educator of the children.
Well, the answer is what is happening in so many other countries. Let her simply take her infant with her. That's what's happened throughout human history. Never did the woman abandon whatever she was doing. She put the infant in a little sling and went right on with her work. I was the last of 8 children, all born at home. My father was a newspaper man. He owned newspapers. And my mother didn't like to stay at home at all. And we had hired help. We could have hired help. And my mother would come home. She'd have our baby. All of us were born at home. But then she simply lugged us off to the newspaper office. She liked to run my father's newspaper. He was the editor, but she kept him going. And I cut my teeth on linotype. I mean, my world was the world of that newspaper, and I loved every minute of it. It was a fantastic place. I had lots of other worlds. I had woods and streams and rivers and all of that kind of thing too. But I could be with my parents in their workaday world, and I wanted to be. We've this young boy here who was here all day yesterday. He's right here in the marketplace. He's right here at the scene of action, you see. And I certainly was too, and my brothers and sisters were too. That's one solution. What we have to do is have industry simply provide for the care of the children, of the mothers, so mothers have continual access to those children as needed. It would save the nation trillions of dollars, you see. We find that a child under age 4 can take about 2 hours of separation from mother, and they love it. But after that, the old anxiety starts coming in. So you've got about a 2-hour period at a time. Then the mother needs to check in. How easy it would be to have daycare right there in any industrial or any office situation. You have to incorporate that into the society, rather than this terrible polarization and separation, this stratiation of society, locking these kids off in a special place, completely isolated from the rest of the society. It isn't working. It isn't working now, and it won't work. So the answer is not for women to have to do an either-or thing if they don't want to. If they elect to stay home and have children, we should give them every conceivable opportunity to. If they elect to work and have children, we should make that work too and make it possible, because we pay a dreadful price when we don't. So these are some, I'm just thinking of some of the approaches that we can take to this, but at base is the critical issue of the revival of the nurturing one, the mother, the matrix, the source from which everything in our species derives its energy and its strength. And without that, we're in trouble. That's what my book is about. That's what most of my books have been about. That's why I concentrate on the mother rather than on the father. And I know that's a thorny issue. In fact, I've received just really extremely excited letters of condemnation over that kind of a position. But I think it's a strong position, and I think I'm right on the factor of nurturing of our young as the critical issue, and nurturing of the male species. They're a fragile species, and that intellect is here for a very special purpose. Don't think it isn't. But you have to nurture it. You have to take care of it, or it'll destroy itself. You remember what Richard Wagner, that enormous genius of the 19th century, said? He said he spotted Cosima. Unfortunately, she was the wife of Hans von Bülow, but that didn't stop him for a minute. And he said, "In that woman I saw that which would save me from myself," which was one of his great motifs running throughout all of his great dramas. That the man sees in the woman that which will save him from himself. And of course, then the whole species is lifted up.